Welcome back, everybody, to this afternoon session. And I'm about to introduce our keynote speaker of this afternoon, Dr. Jennifer Mack from KTH Royal Institute of Technology here, this place, the School of Architecture, where she is an associate professor in architecture history. And Jennifer has a PhD from Harvard University in architecture, urbanism, and anthropology. And her research combines ethnography, history, and formal analysis to study the relationship between social change and the design of the built environment. And one of her recent publications is the book from 2017, The Construction of Equality, Syriac Immigration and the Swedish City. Welcome, Jennifer.
There are countless neat strips of row houses and a host of cozy three-story buildings, a concrete town center, and leafy jogging trails. A suburban feeling and domestic idyll all in one. My Rona is completely different from the neighborhood that is conveyed in politics and the media. So this description comes from journalist Nisha Besara's article about the Swedish suburban neighborhood of Rona in Södertälje, which she portrays as leafy and cozy. This Rona is both visually and socially attractive, a friendly and beautiful place. But Rona and other Swedish suburbs are usually shown like this, or like this. This is actually Rona. With their designs, when their designs are discussed, photos usually show identical housing blocks with wide lawns and words like dry and monotonous. Often you see they're like untouchable spaces that are shown almost always from the air. And when you do see street level images, they look like this, showing burning cars, graffiti, police in riot gear, or crime scenes. So often you would say that for outsiders, there are spaces of danger and violence, and critically, ugliness and concrete. And for the purposes of this lecture, we can also talk about social exclusion. Many late modernist neighborhoods, like Rona, were built during the Swedish Million Program, which of course, as most people in this room know, created 1 million dwelling units between 1965 and 1974. And that was when the Swedish population was actually under 8 million people. The goal for this project was social equality through housing for all, but it was not social housing, so we should be clear about that. With fast-paced construction, some sites had to be leveled to make room for cranes. Designers then drew rational landscapes in the form of playgrounds, parks, paths, bridges, and other open, green, and public spaces, and the kind of housing that we also saw in Daniela's presentation earlier. Today, however, Million Program areas are extremely stigmatized. Their designs are called monolithic, unattractive, and outdoor and public spaces in particular are seen as sort of leftover and dangerous places where things could happen. And meanwhile, the large number of migrant residents who often live in Million Program neighborhoods are somehow causally linked to social problems like rioting and arsons, even murder. Infamously, many Million Program areas joined what was called a police list that labels certain neighborhoods according to their need for police resources. And there were 3 categories of spaces like that. There were vulnerable areas, utsatt område, risk area, riskområde, and also especially vulnerable area, särskilt utsatt område. During their 2018 election campaign, the far-right Sweden Democrat Party made immigrants their scapegoats, but also Million Program suburbs became a focus of their discourse. Sweden Democrat leader Jimmy Åkesson first recommended that national military forces should be assigned to these neighborhoods, and then suggested in an April 2018 interview on Swedish public radio that these neighborhoods should be demolished, to quote him, to start from the start. And what I've discovered in my research is that even urban planners sometimes describe their physical spaces as disposable, replaceable, or beyond repair, especially where the planned town centers are concerned, because they're often seen as sites for gang violence or narcotic sales. In her work on the memory of the senses, anthropologist Nadia Saramatakis argues that the numbing and erasure of sensory realities are crucial moments in sociocultural transformation. So I want to argue today that popular views attempt to numb and erase sensory realities and memories in million program areas, and that these are attempts at exclusion. Suburban residents have, nearly since the moment of their construction, been seen as passive victims of what you could label as, following Peluso and Watts, violent environments. But they're also places that seem to be without history. These concrete suburbs, as they're often called, are a hardscape, a place where no garden would ever grow, no playground would ever hear the laughter of children. Residents' attachments to spaces where they've met friends or walked dogs or sat in the sunshine to read a book, often over decades, are denied. So outsiders portray these spaces as cold and impersonal, unworthy of preservation. But as I mentioned, million program designs actually included landscape architectural features, public spaces, which were really places to steep in affection and memories with family and with neighbors. During ethnographic research and interviews with former and current residents of these neighborhoods, residents have repeatedly described to me their attachments to lush and bucolic spaces, places of freedom, and importantly, places of memory. A green affect that understands modernism's outdoor environments as deserving of respect, and that recognizes them as having a history. And by green affect, what I mean is these reveries and stories and caring suggestions that residents often have that are explicitly contrasting these kinds of definitions of the spaces coming from outside as failed and dangerous or atemporal. And I also want to say that these personal accounts that I've encountered during this research has also raised new questions about the radical scope and methods of proposed and also realized renovation projects that happen in these areas, and may call for new ways to think about inclusion. The inclusion of feelings and memories as legitimate components of contemporary planning processes. So if residents are mostly portrayed as passive prisoners of massive housing blocks that restrain their life choices, the veneration of the million program's green and open spaces suggests that a vibrant green affect has actually grown among the asphalt, swing sets, and vegetation. Anthropologist Christina Schwenkel outlines what she calls post-socialist affect, which links the materiality of bricks to a longing for the paternalism of socialist governance in Vietnam, a nostalgia that traveled from the post-war rubble to the socialist rebuilding period to the capitalist debris of the present. In million program areas, residents' own sensitive understandings of the outdoor spaces share these qualities and show how these spaces have been conspicuously neglected or disparaged. So what were once the highlights of the welfare state, cities of the future for the mid-20th century present, are today often seen as suburbs without a future. And what I'm highlighting here is how residents repeatedly express affection and longing and even a seemingly impossible nostalgia for modernism's outdoor spaces and features. And they also place their hopes in the future in them. So building hundreds of thousands of apartments in a short time during the Million program, of course, required fast-paced construction. And some of the sites for new housing blocks had to be leveled to make room for the cranes that could put the buildings together quickly. Urban designs included child safety measures through efforts like traffic separation and bushes used to cordon off areas for play. Both concrete blocks and car-free living environments in a way broke with this pre-modern past, when many Swedes, we should always remind ourselves, were actually living in unhygienic environments, even without indoor plumbing in most cases. So areas built with these kind of rationalized designs that we saw earlier were initially posited as both desirable and attractive. And then during the global economic crises of the 1970s, these new neighborhoods of the Million Program and their green and public spaces that were not necessarily completely finished, as you can see in this picture, ran up against numerous challenges, with critics noting, quote, the sparsity of vegetation and the rawness of the milieu as some of the specific physical problems. In these places advertised to offer residents the future today, there were, instead, as one author put it, no pathways, no pavements, no playgrounds, brown, muddy space instead of greenness. So today, municipal officials and designers who are working to improve such areas are under intense pressure from politicians who see solutions to the growing national and international perception that these areas are highly troubled. And their troubles are usually connected to their perceived ugliness, and designs meant to signify modernity and hygiene are today instead seen as backward and unkempt. In 2018, Elizabeth, a municipal neighborhood developer, organized a comfort walk in 1 Million Program neighborhood with the headline, "Does a broken street lamp irritate you?" The event website invited participants to join a walk and explain how they thought public safety could be improved. Elizabeth planned the route in advance. It started at 7 p.m. and then ended in a community space at 9 p.m. with coffee, tea, and cake. And when I was walking with the participants, I met individuals from many different organizations. There were representatives from the Social Democratic Party, a neighborhood group that controls the area or patrols the area at night, Nattvandrarna, a private developer, a police officer, planners, and also local residents, many of whom had actually lived in the area for decades. Most participants in this comfort walk, Trivselvandring, expressed tenderness for the physical qualities of the neighborhood. For some who were actually retired, unemployed, or underemployed residents, coming to this comfort walk as a volunteer, you could say, is a type of affective labor that creates not material objects, but, as Michael Hart writes, social networks, forms of community, and biopower. This was evident, for example, as one young man gleefully described how he and his friends often jumped over a fence to retrieve balls from the grounds of a water treatment plant when they escaped from a football field. There were even moral dimensions to sharing positive points of view during this comfort walk, which also caused some moments of mild conflict. When volunteer residents drew upon their sense of attachments to suggest upgrades, for example, like the need to replace broken benches with new ones, others attending as part of their paid work, they actually saw those comments differently. This was true, for example, of a police officer who I will call Theodore. He struggles to control the widespread drug sales going on in the area. So at the beginning of the walk, two older women who had been longtime residents of this neighborhood pointed to an overgrown small park behind the town center, arguing that it should be redesigned with new benches and better lighting. After listening to their proposals, Theodore retorted that such a renovation would, quote, give criminal youths a free buffet for narcotic sales. And he said then, it will be perfect for them. Elizabeth later expressed some frustration over this attitude because she told me that Theodore always seemed to interpret proposed improvements to the neighborhood in terms of their ability to promote crime. For her, the women's proposals were actually sympathetic, since they merely suggested that this small park space should be maintained and renovated rather than strewn with trash and broken furniture. But I wanted to say also that Elizabeth's attentiveness is not necessarily typical of all renovation efforts in Million Program areas. There have been a number of critiques of the participatory planning processes that have been ongoing in such areas. For example, Nazem Tavilzadeh and Lisa Kings observe that municipalities have often attempted to what they call neutralize residents' opinions, rather than including them in further designs. So they gather the opinions, but they don't necessarily use them. When the emotional registers of residents' feedback do not include failed planning and atemporality, but warmth and nostalgia instead, I found they're simply not heard. And I see this as a kind of failure for the planning process itself and for its attempts to be inclusive. So during this coffee break that I mentioned that happened at the end of the walk, participants marked up maps, and some revealed that they'd lived in the area for decades. Many of their stories turned personal. Some of them talked about the 1980s and 90s, when cosmetic adjustments like facade painting were used. These residents repeatedly stressed that maintenance was the major problem. For some retired, under or unemployed residents, this affective labor of volunteering at a comfort walk meant that their green affect could actually frame this place as a long-term home, and critically, a place with memories attached. For instance, Victor, an older man who had lived in the area for 24 years, said that many of the earlier renovations for outdoor areas had failed. He said the renovators claimed, quote, to lift the area, but they didn't do that. He then described how he had lived in a third-floor apartment a block away from an original modernist park. Some of the hedges there were the varietal wild strawberry mock orange, a dark green bush with white flowers that smell strongly of wild strawberries in the summer. With his eyes glazing over, Victor described their delicious scent in the month of June. Naked wild strawberry. You know, the whole neighborhood smelled like wild strawberries. But this feature was destroyed during a renovation. With melancholy, he said, they just took it away. Later, he told me that the hedges disappeared when the municipality placed the work with a private contractor, and they didn't take care of the weeds and so on, he said. So one part of the hedge died, and another part was cut down by the contractors because they had poor knowledge, unquote. So this illustrates how the qualities of the environment that locals experience has sometimes been devastated by the very people whose job it is to improve it, their feelings excluded. Later, private conversations with another Comfort Walk participant, George, echoed this. Since his divorce over 45 years ago, George has lived alone in Norsborg, with visits from his son every other weekend until the boy grew into an adult. When he first moved into the area, the subway had actually not been yet completed, so he had to start his journey from Stockholm, from Fittja, where he took a bus to Norsborg. So he described the opening of the Norsborg subway station, which was in 1975, 3 years after his arrival, as a kind of monumental event in his life and also for the neighborhood. Over the years, George has seen numerous approaches to solve Norsborg's social problems through physical renovations. And we discussed his experiences, and he later actually emailed me with some very emotional texts that he had written about his divorce in part, and also his experiences in Norsborg, all in short story form, so they weren't actually in the first person. But he had written them during the 80s. And he had very mixed feelings that were very evident in these texts. For instance, he told me about how he reacted to some of the area's newest immigrant residents, whom he found mildly threatening, by walking with what he described as decisive steps when passing them on the way to the subway. So he expressed some kind of fleeting disappointment about these social changes to the area, and those surfaced occasionally in conversation with him. But he really only expressed what I would call truly caustic reactions in relation to one physical change, a change initiated by the municipality. His feelings of rage and invisibility were revealed in a message that detailed his recent attempts to intervene on behalf of a public artwork that had been affixed to the side of Riksteatern, a public theater building, in 1988. He wrote, "On the north side there was a relief by Gitten Jönsson. It looked like it was primarily made out of wood. So far, so good. Then decades went by and nothing happened other than the weather and the wind attacked the artwork. In the end, it looked really deplorable. A few years ago, Kulturrådet announced that they would offer several million crowns for measures in million program areas, alias especially vulnerable areas. I propose that we should apply for money to restore Gittan's artwork and restore it to its former glory, to the bosses highest up in the Culture and Recreation Department. No answer. Finally, last year, a patrol arrived, probably the cleaning department from the municipality. They took down the rest of Gittan and replaced the large facade, repainted the large facade with yellow-brown paint. That's what the local residents in Norsborg get to enjoy now. The only positive thing in this story is that the boss I mentioned has now left the municipality. So George attempted to shed light on a needed intervention in order to save the artwork. The initial silence he received from the municipality gave way to a kind of systematic dismissal. His efforts probably produced the exact opposite of his intentions, the violent removal of this local treasure that had enlivened an outdoor public space. So if the municipality encourages residents to participate in the refurbishment of their areas, such conversations appear to be limited only to the officially condoned settings, but also only to the expected responses. George is pleased for this artwork to be respected as something valued to him, but also to the neighborhood, which actually only needed care for its survival when unheeded. In removing the piece and repainting the facade, the outdoor environment of Norsborg was treated as one requiring solely pragmatic aesthetic registers. George's own green affect was treated as, in a sense, as a kind of impossible form of nostalgia, one that paired the Million program with physical preservation rather than renewal. Beyond the comfort walk, another participatory planning method that is used in Million program is something called the citizen dialogue, medborgardialog, where members of the public are asked to contribute ideas for one redesign. For example, Cornflower Park in an adjacent neighborhood was remade after a dialogue with young girls living in the area. When I talked with Nora, the landscape architect behind the design, she said that her main goal was to make the space more gender neutral because men had dominated it, and that was sort of a specific goal of the municipality's ongoing park program. Her design included many program spaces, such as a rollerblading course and a Bluetooth speaker that allows people to play music from private devices for up to 3 minutes. A multicolored rubber mat underneath play equipment replaces the more sedate original color scheme of the first design from the 1970s. And she had actually conducted several dialogues. First, when she was doing the first one, she said that residents had come up with recommendations like, the playground needs to be fixed up, or we want to have more flowers and water, or it feels unsafe, the lighting should be improved. She told me, so we take that in, but one of the goals in the park program is that we should create more equal spaces, places that will welcome girls as much as they do guys. To do this, the municipality charged her with making major changes to this apparently failed space. Certainly, the redesigned park suggests that it has a bright future, and its opening party was a big success. But many of the residents I talked to were mostly relieved that for once, the bushes were trimmed and the lighting was repaired. For them, there was actually no need to wholly reprogram this park. There was merely a sense that care had long been lacking for the one that was already in place. For instance, Marta has lived in Hallunda for 14 years. When she saw the renovated park, she was so moved that she wrote a poem entitled About Cornflower Park, or The Park That Isn't There. So constant descriptions of catastrophe in Million program neighborhoods imply that renewal is necessary while suggesting that emotional attachments are impossible. But for Marta, this park in Hallunda sometimes becomes a place from her childhood, where, as her poem describes, she heard the wind whistling in the trees when she went to milk a cow. She also talks about how a man from Syria imagines Cornflower Park as a park that bombs destroyed in his own country, saying, dearest, that city doesn't exist anymore, but the park is here. Inshallah, hallelujah, hooray. So darn great that the park is here, even though it can never be here. No, it can never be here. The physical elements that made landscape architect Nora proudest, the rubber play surface and rollerblading course, were notably not those that sent Marta into her reverie. She wrote, it's not so remarkable, newly renovated, but still with worn out lawns and a little trashed and broken wooden swings. But it moves me to think that a landscape architect has thought about it and planned it here for us. So for Marta, the acts of care were not installations of equipment, but the clipping of overgrown bushes and trees to allow views and increase safety. Marta's emotions were mostly a response to the sudden presence of what you could call routine maintenance, as she reflected that these landscaping efforts have made the park, and this is to quote her, as in dreams, where there is a door in a well-known room that didn't exist before, and it leads to a room we didn't know existed. So when the care that has been lacking for decades is suddenly provided, rooms that always existed are suddenly reopened, and green affect has room to grow. The national government's 1970 report, Children's Outdoor Environment, put forward new guidelines for children's spaces. Traffic separation would ensure their protection with cars separated from pedestrians using bridges, bushes, and tunnels. But today, pedestrian bridges are also known as the sites from which stones are thrown at police cars, and tunnels are often said to be unsafe. In 1 Million Program neighborhood, a proposal from the city suggested removing pedestrian bridges during a renovation project. To the planner's surprise, protesters organized against the proposal. The bridges were prized for exactly the reasons that they were designed, for their ability to make pedestrian movement safe and efficient. In fact, many adults who grew up in neighborhoods with traffic separation describe these features fondly. For example, 41-year-old Babylonia grew up largely in the Million Program suburb of Fornhöjden, a place in focus for renovations almost from its start in the 1970s. She moved there in 1981 with her parents after migrating from Syria, and she admitted to being teased about it. She said, "My buddies, they say, 'Oh no, are you going to talk about Fornhöjden?' Because I always get tears in my eyes when I talk about it." In a small forest, she developed fantasy games, built traps to make boys trip and fall, and created makeup stations out of found objects. Traffic separation made her particularly happy, allowing her to play wherever she wanted and without parental supervision. She said, "The cars had to keep to themselves on the outside, so if you wanted to come in, you had to find parking. There was no reason to be careful because of cars, because it was so well planned somehow. Safe, safe, safe." So she described this modernist design feature in very glowing terms. But the growing stigma attached to Million Program areas in the 1980s actually led to her family's move to another part of Södertälje, the town in which it was located, around 1987, when Babylonia was 11 years old. She told me about her shock and disappointment to discover that this new area lacked traffic separation. She said, "How could I say it? There was so much more life in Borsta, the new area. There were roads everywhere and cars, and you had to be careful crossing the street in a totally different way. It was a little like, what should one say? You knew you had a limited area where you could move. Without modernist urban design, her space for play had become more limited." She also told me about a photograph that a family member had taken of her from their apartment window in Fornhöjden, showing her running to school in competition with a classmate. She said, quote, "It's that closeness, and like you can just run across a huge field and get to where you're going, and your parents can watch you from above. There's something I just love about that picture. It's like full speed ahead." So designers who express surprise that residents like traffic separation appear to have had very little contact with this green affect that I'm talking about of these kinds of accounts. And even when they're using these citizen dialogues, they seem to start from a position that links current social problems with the original designs, and also excludes ideas that don't adhere to that script. Preservation is often absent in form of other currently preferred approaches such as densification. In response, planners often propose what I could describe as major renovations rather than surgical incisions, sometimes eliminating features that residents actually are talking about very warmly and affectionately, like the wild strawberry mock orange bushes or pedestrian bridges. When the Million Program was being built, Botkyrka municipality produced this dreamy ad saying that we are building a city where every child will have his or her own tree to climb. Here, green spaces were meant to be the grounds for new stories to be told, highlighting not only their newly planned parks and squares, but also their many adjacent natural features, such as the small forest where Babylonia was actually making this makeup station out of glass and paper. Early and long-time residents' recollection suggests actually that these promises were kept to a degree. Today's residents who ask for routine maintenance are not actually arguing against the modernist planning itself, or even its top-down approach, you could say, but merely for an attitude of care and respect for the desires and knowledge of local people that has been missing for decades. What they want is to be included. More than that, residents expect that places that actually have at least 50 years of history will now be treated as sites of intense attachment rather than sites of casual destruction disguised as renovations. Sarah Matakis explains that memory is stored in substances that are shared, just as substances are stored in social memory, which is sensory. So these landscapes comprising parks, mock orange bushes, pedestrian bridges, open fields, and even artworks are now substances, you could say, upon which affect is attached. These spaces shape both collective and individual memories, even as the rights of residents to claim respect for their history is often denied. And I want to close with one additional story. Imre is an interior designer in her 30s who migrated from Turkey and lived in the Million Program area of Norsborg as a child. And when I walked around in the neighborhood with her one fall afternoon in 2018, she described her many positive memories of playing in the sandbox and swinging on the swing set outside her apartment building. But then she said that she was very surprised when she returned there on a university field trip with a professor to see a pedestrian tunnel there. She said, "My professor in light and perception, he took us there. And he just said, this tunnel was really in trouble and it was not fresh. You start to wonder, why is it not fresh? Because no one takes care of it. And here you can't blame the people. The municipality didn't give a shit about it." So Imre's disappointment had to do quite simply with a lack of upkeep. She continued, "I don't think that there's any problem with the architecture there in Norsborg. I think that there are problems with the people who lead. Because there's a really bad ring when you say Million Program, but the Million Program really had a fantastic goal actually. But then there is something wrong with the people in charge of the big questions. It's not the architecture itself, it's the politics that are wrong." In other words, these politics, in her view, do not include the opinions of the people who are actually living there. So if everyone from the police to journalists to people who've never actually visited a Million Program area see them as failed and lacking the need for preservation, they're also seen somehow as different than other urban environments, that they're excluded from these kind of renovations that actually respect the original qualities of the environment. Residents often describe their disappointment with the negative labels. They even feel a sense of shame about residing in areas that are seen from the outside as unlivable or perniciously violent, especially when they don't agree with those accounts, when their green affect and those visions actually don't mesh at all. So when popular descriptions convey the messages that segregation and devastation cannot be overcome somehow in these Million Program neighborhoods, xenophobic messengers like SD's Åkesson argue that the only way to actually save the areas is to destroy them. And you could say that adheres in a sense to the very models of urban renewal that produced these suburbs in the 1960s and 70s in part. This ignores the fact that these cities of the future are actually now pushing the half-century mark. And the stunning lack of routine maintenance that they've often experienced is rarely in focus, and neither are these outdoor and green spaces. And the residents' attachments to them are certainly not part of that story. In her analysis of sensory politics of public housing tenants in Chicago, anthropologist Catherine Fennell describes the unexpected attachment residents had to the high-powered, what she calls project heat, that they lost after being relocated from high-rise dwellings where heat was provided to walk-ups where it was not. The new housing was seen by outsiders as more attractive, but they simply felt cold. The so-called project heat would be extreme for most people with high temperatures up to 35 degrees Celsius inside the apartments. But Fennell's informants made statements after being forced to move like this, quote, "I don't miss anything," insisted Rhoda, a 50-year former resident of the extension. Well, okay, she added as an afterthought, the only thing I can say is that I do miss is the heat. It was the best heat we have ever had. I can't even describe it. That's how good it was. Toasty all the time. Similarly, the attachment that residents of Million Program areas feel for their outdoor spaces go beyond these negative descriptions of them, both in the past and in the present. For residents, in other words, this concrete space is background rather than foreground in what is actually an affectionate and green image of the city. Their green affect repaints these gray and dull neighborhoods in new and vibrant hues that outsiders apparently can't see, and that planners do not want or know how to include, perhaps. But renovation projects to undo mistakes often work against the very materialities that residents appreciate the most. For locals, the problems are the bush gone untrimmed, the worn out grass, the lights that went out years ago, or the pavers that shifted out of place. Public and political imagery portray Million Program neighborhoods as unequivocal failures of both design and of society. So it's not surprising that planners are under pressure to try to produce major, visible, and accountable changes, especially when these suggestions for total destruction are no longer tongue-in-cheek, but are actually coming from elected politicians. But in the outdoor spaces of the Million Program, residents give merit to what has remained undervalued. Views that take you to another time and place, traffic separation that gives kids personal freedom, and bridges and tunnels that ease movement. Residents have an affectionate response to modernist outdoor spaces that have quite literally fallen between the cracks. If what were once cities of the future are today often regarded as suburbs without a future, instead, residents usually express affection, longing, and even a seemingly impossible nostalgia for modernism's landscapes.
There's something you touched upon it, but I was wondering, or I've been wondering about this before, it's about it's a methodological challenge, you could say, you for the planners or the architects or the people in one way or another in charge of working with these areas, as how to adapt or deal with or bring along experience-based knowledge into the planning or design process. As this some of your talk was about the quotes you had, was all about their experience, their memories, this green effect, as you put it. I wonder, have you thought about that? How should we do?
Yeah,
when the old models doesn't really fit?
That's a really good question, and I mean, I have to admit that I haven't really come up with a solution to these issues, because I also see the limitations of the planning process, where I mean, these new ideas about having the comfort walk, and the same planner actually had an event inside a local mall where she tried to gather people who just happened to be walking by to kind of engage with pictures of different things that were in the area. So I mean, there are very creative things that are happening, and I think part of the problem is how those get translated into what then occurs on the ground. And one of the issues with the comfort walk is that these reflections are then assembled into some kind of file that is then distributed to the planning office, but that there are a lot of issues with who owns different parts of the neighborhood, because as many of us know, a lot of these neighborhoods have been heavily privatized. And so there are different owners for different parts of the neighborhood, which creates an entirely new challenge then in terms of who is going to take responsibility for actually doing some of these improvements. But I think one of the things that I would personally suggest, maybe coming from my, I'm an architectural historian, but I'm also an anthropologist, putting on that hat, is to say that maybe there should be opportunities for people to talk in a more qualitative way about their experiences that are not necessarily about sitting over a plan or walking around in the neighborhood. I mean, I think those are really effective tools, but just, the kind of information that I found while talking to people, we were not necessarily walking, sometimes we were, but it was more about, personal memories and things that had happened that were relevant in relation to space, but were not necessarily in a conversation about the space or about the planning process. And I think that that kind of information could actually be valuable for planners and for the planning process.
Yeah, I think there is a lot of, it's a real challenge, because it's, as you touched upon, it's also if you get this information, what you do with it.
Yeah.
So not just put it in a box for a kind of the wish list or something.
Yeah,
And I mean, wish list.
In my previous project, I also talked a lot about how there are very few moments in the planning process where people from the community can actually come with reactions and proposals, and that actually is part of the issue, that if you're only allowed to comment on something if you're personally affected by a particular plan, that's one issue, but also that there are very time delimited activities that happen within planning in which citizens are invited to actually give their opinions, and that once that process is over, there are no other opportunities. That creates a whole other issue, I think, because then it means that there are very bounded categories for what citizen involvement actually is about.
That's true. We could talk a lot about this,
yeah.
Because it's also, if you can think of working strategically and not only thinking of this citizen participation as the thing you need to do in the law, in the planning building process. So is there any, I'm sure there are reflections or questions in the audience.
There's one.
Yeah?
Well, thank you. I think the green affect that you bring up as a term to understand this kind of bottom-up perspective linked to the half-century mark.
Yeah.
There's at least 2 generations that have grown up, and also raises the issue that I'm wondering if you have touched upon of kind of an institutional amnesia related to these places, because in my contact with city archives and other institutions that deal with issues of spatial distribution, architectural museums, etc., there's often a lack of documentation. Whereas in many of the grand modernist projects that preceded the Million Program, there's an over-representation.
Yeah.
So there's a kind of an amnesia and an imbalance, and I'm wondering if you've come across this in your work also.
Yeah, I mean, I think just the fact that we know so little about who the architects of the Million Program housing projects actually are. That those are not like household names in the way that some of the projects from the 50s, for instance, have become. That's like one element of how it then becomes excluded from architectural history in a way where the focus is on the biography in a lot of cases. But I think what I find so interesting is also just this idea that they have no history, that there is no sense that it has actually happened 50 years ago, and that's that's actually more than 50 years at this point. And I was actually reflecting on your talk earlier, thinking about how it seems that one of the things that happens also with these kind of system changes that you were describing are that there are these moments where things become so run down that it seems like the only answer is somehow to completely change the way that things are done. And I find that seems to be what's happening here, where something is left to decay, not recognizing that in fact all buildings need to be repaired, all buildings, all outdoor spaces will shift because of the ground plane moving and rain and other kinds of weather events, and that as some people were even reflecting on as early as the 1970s, trees and plants, they die. You have to replace them from time to time. That's just a normal organic activity. So not recognizing that as part of seeing it kind of in a static way, I think that the original designers may have played a part in that, but it's also the way that it's been received and the way that the Million Program is now regarded to be in many ways this kind of static environment, which I think is also part of the reason why there is this amnesia about it, that it's not seen as like a dynamic space or spaces. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Well,
There's time.
There's time. Yeah.
Thanks, Jennifer, for a great talk. I was curious because you said trees die, but there's also the component of time when these million program neighborhoods were built. The landscapes were very young, and one could argue that they're only reaching maturation now. So is that also a component that you take into your research about evolving?
I mean, this is part of a larger project, which is about outdoor spaces, not just from the Million program, but from the record years, approximately 1960 to 1975. And so, one of the things that I was interested in is some of the critiques that were coming out shortly after a lot of the neighborhoods were built, where they're actually talking about how, in fact, many of the renderings and representations of what these spaces were supposed to look like showed their trees 50 years in the future. So it was also not surprising. And then also the fact that the topsoil had often been removed to make way for, to make a flat ground plane and to make way for these cranes that would then produce the buildings. Some other accounts, and this is not really related to what you were asking, but just the fact that a lot of the species were actually imported from other countries and then struggled, I guess, to actually survive in Sweden. That was another issue, and many times they would import from a nursery one type of bush or tree. And so it became a very kind of monolithic landscape considering like the vegetation. So I think, I mean, it's very interesting to think about how representation affected sort of expectations about what, the quality of life would be like in these neighborhoods. And I mean, I showed you this picture of the kids trying to kind of play in the rubble. And I've heard a lot of stories about things like that happening where like construction sites actually became playgrounds because they weren't finished. So, I mean, this is also one of the big issues, I think, in trying to understand what happened in these spaces, that even in the beginning, they were not, they did not live up to the representations and the expectations. So I think that's one of the big issues with how, their kind of legacy.
Okay,
Do we have time for one more?
I'm not scheduling.
Yeah, no, we do.
Okay, we do, and there's two more. Do we have time for two more?
Go Marta first.
Yeah, okay, we have time.
Thank you, Jennifer. It was fantastic to see the Swedish sides of a story that seems to keep playing on, right? So it brings back to the table the question of maintenance in these very large projects, and I was, even the reference to Catherine Fennell, whose work I love, and even going back to the Pruitt-Igoe myth, which is yet another anthropological account of this same story, and where the residents become the biggest defenders of the projects, right? And whereas then either the architects or the planning departments, the aesthetic paradigm shift, and then they no longer side with this. But that's ultimately, it's at the end, it comes down to the question of the defunding of the agencies that had been, initially appointed to care for this. So I was just wondering, along the lines of Eva's first question, which is, now that there's so much insistence on ideas of sustainability, that in going back to this question of maintenance, just to say, how can we now, go back to return to some paradigms, to certain things that did work, and then that where the residents attest to that, and try to build into the projects their longevity, whereas meaning, how can they start thinking of sustainable models, but that really think on the long term, then how these projects can then be sustained, kept, because even these landscapes, I mean, they reach maturity, but they need to be kept, and that costs money, and so it returns back to the questions of power and funding.
God, I have so many things I want to say in response. I don't know where to start. I mean, one of the issues I was thinking about, in relation to that cornflower park that I was discussing, was also that after the renovation finished, there is a budget in the municipality to have extra maintenance for a period of 2 years. But then after the 2 years end, it goes back to the regular maintenance schedule. And so I start to wonder, what will happen at that point, because obviously there was a huge investment made and they're trying to protect it in a sense, but then you also kind of expect that it can happen, that it will somehow return to the earlier state. And I think one of the big issues is also, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, this idea of how different companies actually are operating in the area. And at that comfort walk, one of the stories that I heard was actually somebody reporting that when people call in with a problem that they want to talk about, that something that needs to be fixed, if they call their company and it's not their property, they don't report it onward. So nobody finds out, and the person who called obviously has no idea that they're calling the wrong company. So I think this is also, I mean, one thing I would argue is that we maybe need to have a more holistic sense of neighborhoods regardless of who is actually owning them, because it is so atomized now. There are so many different owners operating there, and I think that's one of the issues. I was also thinking, kind of in dialogue with your earlier question, about how the defunding maybe also affects these participatory planning processes. And I just recently published an article about how I called it renovation year zero, because what I observed by looking at some of the literature from the 70s and 80s is that these renovation projects were going on from the very, very beginning, like right after construction is completed. They're already seen as problems, and so they have to start doing renovations, you know, from the very, very beginning of the project. But in those, sometimes in those participatory planning processes, they were extremely comprehensive in the sense that they were going on for a year and a half. And they would make sure that they talked to every single person in the neighborhood. And they had offices that were open at night where people could stop by and, you know, express their opinions about an area. So I also thought, you know, this is very interesting in comparison with the sort of, you know, very valiant attempts by people like this Elizabeth who I was talking about, but, you know, somewhat anemic in comparison, which has very much to do with budgetary restraints. I mean, imagine having an architect opening an office in a neighborhood, a million program neighborhood that's open nightly for a year and a half, and we start to understand, you know, the difference in like what level of investment is actually considered normal and important for today's renovations. So I think that that's also maybe an answer to your first question about maybe we can make these processes more robust as they were before.
Okay, that's nice words to
Yeah.
end this. It's 1:15, so thank you
Okay.
for the questions, and thank you,
Thank you.
Jennifer, for a very
Thank
interesting
you.
lecture.
Thanks.